April 9th, 1942. Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. The jungle held its breath. The last American guns had gone silent. For months, soldiers of the United States Army and their Filipino brothers had fought with no food, no medicine, and no hope of reinforcements. Now, the order was clear. Lay down your arms. Rain mixed with sweat as 76,000 men waited beneath a white flag. Their faces were hollow, uniforms in rags, rifles stacked like fallen crosses. Somewhere down the road, they thought, trucks would come to take them to camp. Instead, they heard boots. Japanese infantry marched toward them, bayonets glinting, voices sharp and foreign. One officer barked a command, and the column began to move. The first step sank into warm mud. The second tore open a blister. The third tasted like defeat. They walked past burned trucks, shattered helmets, and the wreckage of the 31st Infantry's last stand. The air smelled of smoke and rotting mangoes. Canteens emptied before the sun reached its highest point. Men whispered for water, for mercy, for anything. None came. Behind them, the stars and stripes burned above a ruined outpost. The last American flag on Bataan. Somewhere in the distance, artillery still echoed from Corregidor, a promise that someone was still fighting. But for these men, the war had turned inward, into the struggle to keep moving. They didn't know it yet. But this surrender would mark the beginning of one of World War II's darkest journeys, a march that would stretch over 65 miles through heat, hunger, and unthinkable cruelty. And for those who survived, every step would echo for the rest of their lives. By early April 1942, Bataan was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard in slow motion. The 14th Imperial Japanese Army under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homma believed this victory would end American resistance in the Philippines. Tokyo called it a final triumph, the moment the rising sun would dominate the Pacific. But deep inside the Japanese ranks, a darker idea guided everything. Their military doctrine taught that surrender was shame. To be captured was to lose your soul. So when 76,000 American and Filipino troops laid down their weapons, their captors didn't see soldiers anymore. They saw dishonor, something to be moved, not something to be fed. In the Japanese field manuals, there was no paragraph for prisoners of war. There were only rules for transport and control. And that meant chaos. General Homma's men had expected maybe 15,000 captives. What they got was 5 times that number. Starving, wounded, dehydrated, no trucks, no food, no plan. Every unit along the road improvised their own solution. To the south, Japanese supply officers scrambled for rice and salt. But the heat spoiled everything before it arrived. To the north, infantry columns marched prisoners without water for miles, shooting those who collapsed. From the sea, you could see the smoke rising over Mariveles. To the east, along the dusty road to San Fernando, lines of men stretched as far as the eye could see, a river of misery winding through palm trees and sun. American commanders, like Major General Edward King, had believed that surrender meant protection under the Geneva Convention. They thought the Red Cross would shield the wounded. They thought the rising sun would honor the rules of war. But war had no rules here. The clash wasn't only between armies. It was between 2 belief systems that could never meet. To the Americans, survival was duty. To the Japanese, death was honor. And somewhere in that gap, humanity was about to disappear. Archival maps now trace the route. From Mariveles at the tip of Bataan, north through Balanga, Pilar, and Lubao, finally to San Fernando, about 105 kilometers. From there, a train would carry survivors to Camp O'Donnell. But they never knew what waited ahead. No one told them how far or why. All they saw was dust. All they heard was the word march. They thought the road led to a camp. It led to a grave. The sun rose like a hammer. By 7 a.m., the temperature on the Bataan Road was already 110 degrees Fahrenheit. No shade, no mercy, no end in sight. Sergeant William Edwin Dias of the 21st Pursuit Squadron remembered the order in one simple sentence. We started walking, and we kept walking. If you fell, you were shot. Around him, the column stretched for miles. Americans in khaki, Filipinos in torn shirts, boots worn through at the soles. Some still carried their dog tags. Others had tied rags around their heads to block the sun. It didn't help. Each step was a negotiation with pain. Shoulders blistered beneath rifle straps. Mouths went dry within an hour. Those who stumbled were kicked up or kicked aside. The Japanese guards, sweating in their own uniforms, carried Arisaka rifles with fixed bayonets. Some rode on captured American trucks, shouting for the marchers to move faster. A few, tired of shouting, used the rifle butts instead. At first, the line moved slowly. Then the pace quickened. A cruel rhythm between life and collapse. A man would fall, and a shot would crack. Another would try to help, and another shot would follow. Within minutes, the dust hid the bodies. Dias wrote later, "I could smell the death before I saw it, a kind of sweetness that stayed in your throat." By noon, heat shimmered like fire across the road. Canteens were empty. Men began to hallucinate, seeing rivers where there were none, imagining the sound of waves. Some bent to scoop water from ditches. The guards shouted. One raised his rifle, fired once, then ordered the others forward. From the roadside, Filipino villagers appeared. Old women, children, clutching handfuls of rice or coconuts. They whispered, "Tubig, tubig," the Tagalog word for water. They tossed food toward the prisoners. Japanese soldiers turned, shouting, and opened fire. The food fell into the dust, mixing with blood. Still, one boy ran forward again. He never came back. The march went on. Hours passed, but time lost meaning. The only measure left was footsteps and fear. Boots scraped the gravel in perfect unison. Thousands of souls moving like one broken heartbeat. At dusk, the shadows lengthened. You could see the road littered with helmets, torn packs, and the still forms of those who hadn't made it. Flies gathered on their faces. No one stopped. No one dared. Dias glanced at the horizon. Mountains glowed red under the setting sun. Not from light, but from burning villages. He realized something then. "We thought this road led to a camp," he wrote, "but it led to hell." When darkness came, it did not bring rest. It brought confusion. The march didn't stop at sunset. The column kept moving through the night, guided by flashlights and the glare of truck headlights bouncing off helmets. Men stumbled forward half asleep. Some whispered prayers. Others just stared ahead, eyes empty, walking because the man in front of them walked. Sergeant William Dias remembered the smell before anything else. Rotting bodies by the roadside, open latrines, spilled blood. The stench clung to every breath. In the flicker of headlights, he saw men trying to crawl away from the line, hoping to die unseen. Guards found them, dragged them back, beat them with rifle stocks. Sometimes the blows stopped, sometimes they didn't. At dawn, the heat returned. Heavier, crueler. One soldier collapsed, clutching his stomach. His friend tried to lift him. A Japanese guard shouted, raised his rifle, and fired. The friend didn't move again. The road became a gallery of horror. Abandoned helmets, torn boots, canteens crushed under truck tires. And beside them, the bodies, sprawled like broken dolls under the relentless sun. There were moments when the landscape almost fooled you. Palm trees waved gently. The air shimmered above rice paddies. From a distance, it looked peaceful. But up close, every sound was pain. Coughing, groaning, the scrape of boots on dust. The locals risked everything to help. A farmer tossed a mango toward the line. It rolled near Dias's feet. He kicked it to another man. A gesture of defiance, a spark of humanity. A guard saw it. The farmer was shot. The column kept walking. Dias would later write, "We had no idea how far we were going, only that every mile was a test, not of strength, but of how long a man could watch others die and still keep moving." By the fourth day, disease began to spread. Dysentery, malaria, exhaustion. Men walked with vacant eyes, murmuring to ghosts. Some stripped off their shirts and stumbled naked in the heat. They no longer cared who saw them, or if they survived. Occasionally, a Japanese officer would ride past on horseback, shouting at the guards to hurry. The pace increased again. The weak were left behind. Gunshots followed. When it rained, it wasn't relief. It turned the road into thick mud. Men slipped, fell, and couldn't get up. The mud swallowed their footprints, and then their bodies. At night, lightning flashed over the horizon. The storm lit up the faces of the living and the dead in one blinding frame. A portrait of war's true cost. Dias saw a Filipino priest kneel beside a fallen man, tracing a small cross in the dirt. The guard didn't stop him. For a moment, mercy returned. Small, fragile, fleeting. Finally, after days of walking, the survivors reached San Fernando. They'd covered nearly 105 kilometers, 65 miles of suffering. What waited there wasn't freedom. It was a train. Boxcars meant for cargo, not men. More than 100 were forced into each car. No air, no space, no light. The heat turned iron walls into ovens. When the doors opened again, some men were standing, but not breathing. Those still alive were marched again. The final miles to Camp O'Donnell. There, behind bamboo fences, disease finished what the march had started. Of the 76,000 who began, thousands never reached that gate. Dias would survive to tell the story. But every time he spoke, his voice trembled on the same line. We thought surrender was the end of war. We didn't know it was the beginning. Before the world called it the Bataan Death March, it was simply logistics gone mad. In early April 1942, the Imperial Japanese 14th Army under Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa faced a problem no officer wanted: what to do with 76,000 starving prisoners, 10,000 Americans, 66,000 Filipinos. No plan, no transport, no supplies. The Army had prepared for 15,000, but Bataan collapsed faster than anyone imagined. Homa's staff expected small surrender pockets. Instead, they got an entire army laying down arms. The numbers broke the system overnight. Mariveles, a narrow peninsula of jungle and dirt roads, became a choke point of chaos. Thousands of exhausted men crowding the same path north. The heat reached 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The humidity turned sweat into steam, and through it all, the Japanese supply trucks, already running on fumes, had to choose between moving ammunition or moving prisoners. They chose the bullets. From Mariveles to Balanga, to Pilar, to Lubao, to San Fernando. 105 kilometers, 65 miles, less than 5 official water stops. None for the first 30 kilometers. The Japanese medical units were already drained. The wounded from both sides clogged the same roads. No rations, no shade, no system. It wasn't planned cruelty. It was a total logistical collapse, multiplied by contempt. Prisoners were divided into columns of 500. Each group marched at its own pace, depending on who commanded it. Some guards offered sips of water, others killed for the same request. Discipline disintegrated into improvisation. Homa's army didn't have enough trucks or fuel to move supplies for its own troops, let alone prisoners. The Imperial Japanese Navy had cut sea shipments to Luzon for frontline operations. So the 14th Army resorted to human transport. prisoners carrying their own burdens under the sun. To the Japanese, it was simple arithmetic. Less food wasted, less energy spent. To the prisoners, it was the slow mathematics of death. Compare this to Europe the same year. German POW camps followed ration standards, roughly 2,000 calories per day. Water, bread, soup, minimal but recorded. In Bataan, 0. There was no supply table, no paper trail, no mercy. Archival photos from the Signal Corps show it clearly, lines of men moving like smoke across the jungle road, while Japanese trucks thundered past loaded with gasoline, not water. Each mile was a unit of exhaustion. Each day, the 14th Army's command lost track of another 100 prisoners. And because there was no central record, no one knew who was dead and who was just left behind. By the third day, the columns had stretched nearly 30 miles long. At night, guards couldn't even see the men they commanded. There were no radios, no medics, just torchlight and silence. Homa's headquarters at Balanga received scattered reports. Many prisoners collapsed, discipline low, situation impossible. He scribbled an order. Proceed with movement. Expedite. That word, expedite, sealed the fate of thousands. Speed meant survival for the Japanese war machine. But for the men on that road, speed meant death. They thought they were being moved to a camp. But every kilometer stripped away the illusion of control from both sides. By the 5th day of the march, what had begun as a column of soldiers had become a moving graveyard. Yet from the point of view of Japan's 14th Army staff, it was still a transport problem. In the records recovered after the war, you can see the numbers. Hand-drawn tables, smudged with sweat. Total prisoners, 76,000. Destination, San Fernando. Estimated completion, 7 days. Under remarks, a single line. Food, minimal. The order chain was collapsing. Colonel Motu Nakamura, head of logistics, sent desperate messages to Manila. No rations, roads jammed, request trucks. The answer came hours later. All vehicles assigned to ammunition priority. So the Army improvised. Captured American jeeps and trucks were pressed into service. But most had no fuel. Gasoline was worth more than life. The few running vehicles carried Japanese wounded and officers, leaving prisoners to walk. The route north followed the spine of Bataan. Jungle on one side, sea on the other. Every bridge had been bombed or burned during the retreat, forcing columns to wade across rivers waist deep. At each crossing, rifles and boots disappeared in the current. Men slipped, sank, and were dragged downstream. Those who couldn't climb the far bank were left behind. Archival aerial photos later showed the path. A dark scar of trampled earth winding through rice paddies. Wherever the column stopped, the ground turned black with flies. Japanese medical officers were overwhelmed. They had no morphine, no bandages, not even clean water. Prisoners begged for mercy. The doctors turned away. Their orders were to tend Japanese casualties first. Everyone else was non-essential. Meanwhile, temperature readings from field diaries record peaks above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Even the guards began to collapse. Corporal Shinji Sato wrote in his notebook, "We had no strength left to beat them. We only shouted. The sun punished us all." But the difference was simple. The guards could stop. The prisoners could not. By nightfall of April 12, the first groups reached Lubao, roughly halfway to San Fernando. Out of 500 in one column, less than 300 were still standing. Others lay along the roadside, faces gray beneath the moonlight. From there, the remaining marchers were herded into open fields for the night. There was no food distribution, no water detail, no medical check. Men drank from puddles and ditches where the dead had fallen. Dysentery spread before dawn. Inside Homa's headquarters tent, aides reported the losses. One major suggested halting the movement to reorganize. Homa refused. He scribbled a note in his log. Delay unacceptable. Tokyo expects results. And so the march continued. Every delay was punished, every hesitation met with a rifle butt. In Europe, a convoy of prisoners would have been logged, counted, fed. Here, no such lists existed. At Balanga, the Japanese simply marked the number of men remaining. By the time they reached San Fernando, the total had fallen by thousands. Even the arithmetic of death went unrecorded. When asked later about casualties, one officer shrugged. "We did not count. They were enemy." The supply failure wasn't just human. It was strategic. The same trucks that could have carried prisoners north were instead moving gasoline to airfields at Clark and Nichols. Fuel for the next offensive outweighed the lives of captured soldiers. Logistics had become ideology. In modern terms, it was a textbook example of a system designed for victory, not for aftermath. When you strip war of its humanity, the spreadsheets keep running even as men fall off the page. By the time the march reached San Fernando, the prisoners were beyond exhaustion. They had walked nearly 65 miles in 7 days, under heat that warped the air and stripped the skin from their shoulders. Only the promise of a rest kept them moving. But what waited was not rest. It was a train. Rows of iron boxcars stood on the siding. Japanese freight wagons built to hold 30 men or 6 horses. Guards ordered more than 100 prisoners into each car. No air holes, no windows, no water. When the doors slammed shut, darkness swallowed them whole. Inside, bodies pressed chest to back until no one could move. The air turned liquid with heat and breath. Someone shouted for space, another for water. Both voices disappeared. Sergeant William Dias later recalled, "We tried to breathe in shifts. Those near the doors lived longest." After an hour, the metal walls burned to the touch. Men fainted standing up. When the train finally began to move, the jolts knocked the dead against the living. The smell of sweat and blood mixed with rust and oil. For some, the trip lasted the 3 hours. For others, nearly a day. No one knew. There were no clocks, only darkness. Outside, the countryside rolled past. Sugarcane fields, small villages, women clutching children as the black cars rattled by. Few knew what they carried. Those who did crossed themselves and looked away. When the train reached Capas, the doors opened to light and silence. Many prisoners were still standing, but not breathing. Japanese soldiers shouted for the living to unload the cars. They dragged out bodies and stacked them by the tracks. No count was taken. From there, the survivors walked the final miles to Camp O'Donnell. The camp had been a Philippine Army training base, a handful of barracks surrounded by bamboo fencing. Now it became a death factory. Water pumps failed within days. There was one spigot for thousands of men. The line for water stretched half a mile, guarded by bayonets. The sick collapsed where they stood. Dysentery and malaria swept through the huts like fire. Between April and June, more than 10,000 died, roughly 1 in 8 of all who had surrendered. The Philippine soldiers were buried in mass graves behind the camp. American dead were logged on scraps of paper if logged at all. Signal Corps photographers who arrived after liberation in 1945 captured the aftermath. Skeletons walking in uniforms that hung like curtains, faces hollow, eyes distant. Those images, published in Life magazine, would finally show the world what Bataan meant. After the war, investigators tried to reconstruct the numbers. How many had started the march? How many reached the camp? No 2 reports agreed. Even survivors argued over the distance, the days, the dead. What remained consistent was the pattern, a system that failed because it was never designed to care. Homa's army had 7 days to move 3 times the number of prisoners it expected. There were no logistics officers trained for humanitarian work, no doctrine for mass surrender. The Japanese code of Bushido saw captivity as disgrace. And so, neglect became policy. When Homa stood trial in Manila in 1946, prosecutors showed him maps and photographs. He wept, insisting he hadn't known. But the documents told a different story. Reports signed in his own hand, acknowledging irregularities during transfer. He was found guilty and executed by firing squad. For the survivors, justice felt hollow. The march had lasted barely a week. Its shadow would last a lifetime. They had been promised a camp. They found a graveyard. And yet, for those who endured, every breath after was an act of defiance. Proof that humanity could outlast even the machinery of war. It was January 1945 when the U.S. Sixth Army landed again on the beaches of Luzon. 3 years after the fall of Bataan, 3 years since the march. When the first American patrols reached Camp O'Donnell, they didn't find soldiers. They found ghosts who could walk. Bones under rags. Eyes sunken so deep you could mistake them for shadows. When a medic offered a cigarette, one prisoner wept. He hadn't seen tobacco since 1942. A corporal wrote home, "They looked like that they were carved out of death." The world soon saw what they saw, life and time. Magazine published the photos, grainy, harsh, undeniable. The images of Bataan survivors, hollow faces behind barbed wire, ignited outrage across America. From the streets of New York to the farms of Iowa, one phrase began to appear on posters, newsreels, and lips. Remember Bataan. It became more than a memory. It became a battle cry. Marines shouted it on the beaches of Guadalcanal. Pilots carved it into the metal skins of their aircraft. Soldiers whispered it in the mud of Okinawa. Everywhere, the same promise echoed. This time, we would not surrender. The liberation of the Philippines wasn't just a strategic victory. It was a moral reckoning. When Allied troops entered the remnants of the Japanese prison camps, they found evidence that chilled even hardened soldiers. Logbooks listing thousands of missing names. Mass graves marked only by broken helmets. A bamboo stockade where prisoners were beaten until bamboo splintered. A U.S. Army nurse, Lieutenant Beulah McCulley, who had been captured at Bataan's fall and survived years in an internment camp, later wrote in her memoir, "We lived in a world where kindness was contraband. To survive, you had to hide hope like a weapon." Meanwhile, in Tokyo, news of the atrocities reached high command. Many claimed ignorance, but paper trails tell another story. Reports sent from Luzon described extreme attrition among prisoners, a polite military code for mass death. After Japan's surrender, the reckoning came swiftly. The Manila War Crimes Tribunal convened in January 1946. Among the defendants, Lieutenant General Masaharu Homa, the man who commanded the 14th Army. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from both sides, Japanese soldiers, Filipino civilians, and American survivors, painted the same picture. An army unprepared, an ideology that saw surrender as sin, and a chain of command that chose silence over mercy. Homa's defense claimed he never ordered the killings, that he was unaware. But the prosecution read his own field notes aloud, lines written in his hand. "The situation with prisoners is most regrettable. We must expedite their removal." Expedite. That same word, the one written on orders 3 years earlier, returned now like a curse. In February 1946, the verdict was announced. Guilty of war crimes. Sentence, death by firing squad. When asked for a final statement, Homa said quietly, "I am sorry for the tragedies of war." No one applauded. There was only silence. The march that began with 76,000 men had ended here, in a courtroom in Manila, with one man accepting the weight of them all. But justice could not bring back the dead, nor could it erase the sound, the endless boots against the dust of Bataan. For the survivors, the war never truly ended. Many carried the march inside them, in their nightmares, in their hunger, in the ache of every scar. Sergeant William Dias, who escaped captivity and later wrote the Dias story, put it simply, "They took our freedom, not our faith." In the months that followed the trials, America began to look inward. Victory had come, but so had the reckoning. Military planners, stunned by the reports from Bataan, rewrote the rules for how the United States would treat prisoners of war. It wasn't just policy, it was a promise. Before 1945, the Geneva Conventions were a pamphlet in most officers' pockets, a list of ideals rarely tested. After Bataan, it became doctrine. Every base, every field manual, every soldier trained to understand that the way you treat a captive defines the nation you fight for. In Washington, new directives ordered medical care and food rations for all POWs equal to those of U.S. troops. Because, one general said, the day we forget their humanity, we lose our own. The difference was measurable. During the Korean War, less than a decade later, American prison camps reported survival rates above 95%, compared to the unimaginable losses of Bataan, where 1 in 8 never made it out alive. The U.S. Army called it the Bataan Reform. But for the men who lived through the march, reform was only paper. The real test was memory. Life magazine revisited the survivors in 1947. The photographs showed them home again, thin, smiling, standing beside wives and children. But behind every smile was the echo of the road. Nightmares, sudden panic at the sound of marching feet, the instinct to hide food under the bed. Psychologists had no name for it yet. Today we call it trauma. Back then, it was simply the Bataan look. In Manila, memorial services began at dawn each April 9th, the anniversary of surrender. Filipino villagers who had risked their lives tossing rice and water to the prisoners stood beside American veterans. They prayed together, heads bowed, as the names of the dead were read aloud. No one spoke when the list ended. Silence was the only tribute that felt honest. Across the Pacific, in classrooms and newsreels, the story of Bataan became a warning. Proof that discipline without compassion turns armies into engines of suffering. The U.S. War Department released documentaries titled The Price of Neglect and Remember Bataan. They weren't about revenge. They were about vigilance, about remembering what happens when arrogance replaces empathy. In Japan, too, a generation of young officers studied the same lesson. Declassified training notes from the early 1950s show Japanese cadets reading case studies of Bataan under the heading Humanity in Defeat. Even among former enemies, the march had become shorthand for moral failure. One Japanese soldier, Corporal Shinji Sato, whose diary survived the war, wrote, "I used to think honor was dying for the emperor. Now I believe honor is never forgetting the faces of the men who died beside me, American or Japanese." Back in the United States, the survivors formed the Bataan Veterans Organization. They lobbied Congress to recognize the Filipino soldiers who had marched with them, brothers in suffering who had been forgotten in the politics of independence. Their campaign succeeded in 1948, when Congress granted citizenship and full veterans benefits to thousands of Filipinos who had served under the U.S. flag. For them, it wasn't charity, it was closure. Sergeant Ramon Ramos, one of the last living Filipino marchers, said at a ceremony, "We carried the same rifles, the same hunger, the same pain, and now, at last, the same honor." Today, if you walk the Bataan Memorial Mile in New Mexico or the Bataan Death March Trail in the Philippines, you can still hear the echo of boots in the gravel. Each step is marked with a name. Each name a reminder that war is not numbers. It's endurance. At the center of the memorial stands a plaque. Its inscription is simple. "They took our freedom, not our faith." That line has outlived every flag that flew over Bataan. It became the bridge between nations once divided by war. A testament that even in humanity's darkest march, faith walked beside them. When the guns finally went silent and the smoke over the Pacific cleared, the memory of Bataan refused to fade. It wasn't a story told in triumph, but in warning. In the years after the war, the United States military rewrote its own code of conduct. In 1956, the Field Manual on the Treatment of Prisoners of War was published. Every sentence carried the weight of what happened in the Philippines. It stated plainly, the dignity of a prisoner must be preserved, regardless of circumstance. It was the first time that the lessons of Bataan were not carved in stone, but in policy, a line between civilization and cruelty. Across America, veterans returned to quiet lives, carpenters, teachers, mechanics. But each April, they gathered again. In New Mexico, where the desert heat mirrors Bataan's, they built the White Sands Bataan Memorial. In Washington, D.C., a small granite wall carries the names of the fallen. And in Manila, on the slopes of Mount Summit, a massive white cross rises 400 feet into the sky, the Dambana Hinkagitingan, the Shrine of Valor. From the air, it shines like a blade of light piercing the jungle, a symbol not of victory, but of endurance. Each memorial tells the same story in a different language. In English, valor. In Tagalog, kabayanihan. In silence, never again. Visitors still come. They bring their children. They walk the paths lined with stone crosses, where names have been weathered smooth by time. Some bring sand from the Philippines, some from New Mexico, because for the men who marched, both grounds are sacred. Sergeant Ramon Ramos, one of the last survivors, said it best at a ceremony in 1980. "We marched so no one else ever would." That sentence became the closing line on many plaques, but also the opening line of every new soldier's education. Because Bataan wasn't only about war, it was about the soul of logistics. A reminder that in an industrial age, even machines depend on the morality of men. In factories, supply chains, and battle plans, efficiency is worshipped. But in Bataan, the world learned a brutal truth. When supply chains forget the human being, they stop carrying fuel and start carrying souls. Today, as the sun sets over Bataan Memorial Park, shadows stretch across the white crosses. The light turns gold, then red, then fades into the same dusk that once fell over Mariveles in 1942. It is quiet again. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of boots, the whisper of a promise kept, a promise that pain would not be wasted, that faith would outlast fear, that the march would never happen again. The veterans are gone now, their uniforms folded in wooden chests. But the road remains, carved into history, marked by footsteps that taught the world a lesson too costly to forget. And as the camera pulls back, the cross is bathed in orange light, the wind carrying the faintest sound of marching boots. One line lingers. In industrial war, supply chains carry more than fuel. They carry souls. They tried to destroy us by marching us to death. Instead, they marched us into memory. From a Bataan survivor's diary, 1946. The road from Mariveles to San Fernando is quiet now. The jungle has swallowed the scars, but not the echoes. Each step of that march, each lost voice, still hums beneath the soil. You can walk that same ground today. You'll see sunlight spilling through the palms, hear birds instead of gunfire. But if you pause long enough, you might feel it. The heartbeat of 76,000 souls who once walked it before you. Bataan was not only a story of death, it was a story of endurance, of men who proved that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to stop walking. Subscribe to Battle Records for more stories from World War II that history nearly forgot. But humanity must never repeat.